So the next topic is the West versus the rest. And I had asked Jayant if we could talk about this because I've heard both Doug Casey and Jayant talk about this on a couple of occasions. And I always appreciated their opinions and acknowledged their facts. One thing I didn't like, though, is that the discussion was always one-sided. Not their fault, obviously. They have opinions and positions, but they were unopposed. And that's never any fun. So I asked Jayant if we could do this. He agreed, and I brought my bodyguard here, who though we haven't discussed this, I hope he's kind of on my side. So let's have Jayant come back up. We have Doug Casey, Rick Rule, and we'll use the same format we used before. So I'll start with a few remarks. I'll pass it to Jayant, and then we'll go with Doug and Rick, and then open up to questions. So Doug's done the talk before. I'm sure you've heard it. He talked about it a little bit in his last talk, which was great because it gives a great lead-in. He's obviously somewhat critical of the rest of the world, and I guess I'll start with saying, well, at least he acknowledged the contributions to the culinary arts. What were your favorite dishes again? General Tso?
General Tso's chicken's favorite. Mongolian beef.
Mongolian beef.
Very
so
good. I mean,
acknowledged a few contributions.
Yeah, no, there's others. There's thousands of Chinese dishes. I like them all.
So, well, I appreciate that. It's like, was that really a concession? I mean, is that not obvious, right? I mean, East versus West in food. I mean, what are we talking about? Shepherd's pie? Bangers and mash? I mean, what is it? Are you serious?
You know, when when Charles de Gaulle and Mao were talking, and Charles de Gaulle said, well, we have French cuisine, it's the best in the world. And Mao said, well, you know, it's 1 out of 5 cuisines, but the other 4 are Chinese. You know, you got Szechuan and Cantonese, and you know, that are all very different.
So you know, I mean, I don't really have that much firsthand knowledge. I tried to, you know, I Googled British cuisine just as research. Google returned LOL. So I'm just going off repressed memories from college when I was force-fed this stuff. But I have nothing against, I mean, I'm a product of the West. So really, I'm kind of a neutral participant here. I got no beef with the Europeans. I have no beef with the British. There's been many contributions, obviously, in common law, for instance, private property. But, you know, with the food, they've kind of been freeloading off the rest of the world for a while. So I'll say Magna Carta, thumbs up. Mince pie, you can keep that. So I have actually two serious criticisms of the argument that Doug and Jayant advance. And one is, I think that they're cherry picking a little bit, because certainly if you took score now, the West would do very well. But now is an arbitrary time, right? Taking score, all that matters is the end of the game, right? Not halftime. And are we at halftime? Or to use a baseball analogy, you know, where are we? Is it the 9th inning? Is it the 6th? Is it the 5th? Maybe it's spring training. Maybe we're not even playing baseball yet. Maybe we haven't evolved to that point. If you had taken score at some other point, and I'm by no means a historian, you may have come up with a very different conclusion. You may have found that African people were ahead at one point. And I wouldn't be surprised at all if that were the case. So I think that part is arbitrary. But the more serious thing, I think, is that you can't pick and choose what you're going to consider. So for instance, culturally, if you're going to hold up French cuisine as an example and take credit for that, you also have to explain the sizzler, right? I mean, this is an American creation. If you're going to claim Sound of Music, then you got to explain Cats. If you're going to hold up the Rolling Stones, which I know Doug is a fan, you also own Vanilla Ice. basically what I'm saying is that the forces that are attacking the West are in fact the West itself. The West isn't being attacked. It's suffering from an autoimmune disorder. Okay? Where does political correctness come from? Who created Bernie Sanders or AOC? Right? Social justice warrior phenomenon, where is that coming from? My argument is the West is killing itself. It's all the West. And if the West is in fact killing itself, does it deserve to be preserved and saved? With that, I'm going to turn it over to Jayant.
All right, so I want to just start with definitions first, what I mean by the West. For me, the Western society is about Europe, North America, Canada, USA, Australia, and New Zealand. I also like to add East Asia in my definition, and the reason is that countries like Japan, Singapore, Korea, Taiwan have very passionately copied and adopted Western ways of life. These people, what I just defined as the West, comprise of only 2.5 billion people. There are 7.5 billion people on the planet. The rest is basically the third world countries and euphemistically called emerging markets. Now, in my definition of the West, I also actually include China because it is showing the potential to become a Western kind of society. Let's talk about the rest. Rest has 5 out of 7.5 billion people on the planet. East Asia copied the Western ways, the products of Western society. The rest is not interested in those. The rest is not even interested in how the West became prosperous. It is tempted by only one thing, and that is the products, the fruit of Western society. And that fruit is not the fruit that Doug Casey was talking about earlier, and these are the material fruit that the rest is interested in. When the rest looks at the West, all it sees is entertainment, easygoing lifestyle, freedom from responsibility, charitable governments, free healthcare, consumerism, Kim Kardashian, social welfare, and good salaries. The people of the rest either want to become economic migrants in the West, or they want to copy Western lifestyle in material sense, not in philosophical sense. And they actually, because they are only interested in material fruit of the Western civilization, they don't even get it that you have to generate wealth before you can use it. What the rest, the third world, sees as the Western society has nothing, they can't connect reason and morality as the foundations of the West. And this is the reason why the rest always wallows in poverty, oppression, and they always exist at the edge of Malthusian equilibrium. Nothing that the rest has, because they don't have the concept of reason, nothing they have is sustainable. Neither capital nor institutions. Everything has a pull towards decay, disintegration, and degradation. The contribution, let's talk about some of the places in the rest. The contribution that the West made to Africa was immense. For all practical purposes, sub-Saharan Africa had no written language, no technology of farming, and no tools before the arrival of Europeans. They actually had Arabic in the northern part of sub-Saharan Africa, but they hadn't figured out a use for the language. It was only for the purposes of learning Quran. In the third world, you see girls in school uniforms with water buckets on their heads. Despite that, the concept of the wheel has been in existence for 5,000 years and has been offered on a silver platter to these people in the third world, and they go to the school. They haven't really figured out the use of the wheel. In the third world, they have been taught English, at least in a lot of African countries and in Indian subcontinent, now for centuries. But what they have is pidgin, a simplistic, unnuanced, lacking in grammar language. And this has to happen because complex language sticks in your society only if you have an interest in ideas, planning, or something that is outside your immediate needs. What the people of third world are interested in is not even tomorrow. They mostly don't get the concept of tomorrow. Their communication needs are limited to teasing each other, their consumption needs, their activism for free stuff, and discussing celebrities. That is the limit of their language, the reason why language is pidgin in the third world when they have adopted English. Christianity, missionaries tried to spread Christianity to enlighten people of the third world. What did Christianity become in Latin America or Africa? Voodoo, heavily mixed with superstitions. For now, decades, formal education has been tried on people in the third world. And a lot of institutions are still very optimistic about what formal education will lead to in the third world. But formal education has resulted into nothing but rote learning in the third world. They have only one purpose why they do education, and that is to get a paper certificate at the end of that education. They see that paper certificate as a magic wand. Now here is another layer of problem. This formal education, because it sits unassimilated in irrational minds, makes their mind very heavy. They become very stressed. And the result is that ritualistic religion is spreading in the third world, correlated, ironically, with formal education. Let's go on and on talking about what good the West did to the rest and what ended up happening. Steel was provided to the rest. Instead of bridging factories and bridges, what did people in Africa do? They made machetes to kill each other. A couple of decades back, and it is still very common among social conversations, that internet is going to change the third world. It has reduced the distance between people, and internet, according to them, is going to spread the truth, knowledge, and awakening among the people in the third world. But if you pay closer attention, you realize that if they are not watching pornography, they are circulating superstitions, political activism, or exchanging rumors. In my view, European colonization gave a rational system for the third world to operate in. Christian missionaries tried to infuse the concept of reason among these people, and sometimes they became so desperate that they even removed children from their parents. But all these attempts made only a marginal difference despite 5 centuries of trying to change the third world. Departing European colonizers transferred Western tools, technology, institutions, rule of law to the democratically elected bodies of the third world. But all you can see today is that every single of that tool has been subverted and is being used for tribalistic purposes. All the advantages, given their mindset of expediency, has been frittered away through wars, excessive consumption, malinvestments, and population growth. So the question is, what is the fundamental problem of the third world? Why does all this spread of good things from the West does not stick on the third world and actually make their lives worse eventually? The reason is that among the people in the third world, the concept of reason is conspicuous by its absence. And I'm not exaggerating when I say that. The concept of reason is conspicuous by its absence in the third world. Without reason, you can't accumulate anything, nothing intellectual, nothing financial. The operating system, if you try to carry on a discussion with people in the third world, you realize that the operating system in their minds is tribalism, superstitions, magical thinking, and irrationality. They simply don't get the concept of reason. And this operating system of irrationality makes them impervious to absorb Western intellectual capital. Without the concept of reason, ladies and gentlemen, there's no civilization possible. And that is why third world is savage and barbaric. Since the departure of European colonizers, the third world has consistently regressed culturally and institutionally to pre-colonial dark ages. None of these third world societies, and I'm talking about every single third world country, none of these societies are sane or stable by themselves. A time must come as a result, and I think the time has already come, when the West will no longer be able to contain the third world and keep it sane. That will be the start of the worst humanitarian crisis humanity has ever seen. Remember, 5 billion out of 7.5 billion people on the planet live in the third world. The remaining 2.5 people are what I call the West and have a hope of survival. Thank you very much.
I'm not. Yeah, I agree with that generally. On the other hand, how does it? I don't know how it works out when an American family adopts kids from third world countries and brings them up in the family. Does that work out? I'm not sure. Like, I have a friend in Aspen. She's an ex-Playboy cover girl, and she was abused when she was a kid, and so she feels that she's got to help, be a humanitarian and help every kid in the world. The more underprivileged, the better. So she went to Haiti and raised all kinds of money from rich Aspenites and set up orphanages and things like that, and adopted personally a bunch of Haitian kids. And it's not working out well. It really isn't, because even then, when she brings these kids to her ritzy home in Aspen, these kids, I don't know, they don't identify with that culture. They identify with gangsta culture, because there are other black people that I don't understand. I'm just wondering if it's really possible. I guess over several generations. Maybe our time frame is too short. Mike and I were talking earlier about the question of time, and everybody thinks, wow, 100 years, 200 years, long time. Well, not really. Earth has been around 4.5 billion years. The universe has been around 13.7. That's a pretty long time, isn't it? But do you know that the best projections are that the universe, it's the universe, not just our galaxy, but these billions of other galaxies, that before it all ends with entropy, the universe is probably going to go on several hundred trillion years. So right now, at 14.7 billion years, we're just at the tiniest little beginning of everything in the universe. Forget about what we're doing here. I don't know, anything could happen. People are going to speciate into hundreds of different species in the future as we go into the planets. In fact, I'll go further. I like to go further. I like to double down. I wonder if people are already speciating on mental grounds. I mean, I talk to some of these woke people, and I figure, I don't care how good looking the chick is. I said, I couldn't mate with this chick intellectually any more than I could mate with a chimpanzee physically.
Probably being 70.
Well, I know but that was the case in the old days too. That was the case in the old days too. So I don't know how to answer it, but I think the third world is going to collapse at its present stage if the West stops sending it capital and technology. I think it really will. I mean, I don't see anything in Africa. I know the statistics are that African economies are advancing at, breakneck speed, and there are buildings that are going up and roads. It's mostly the Chinese that are doing that today, I think. I don't think it's. I don't know. It's too early to tell. It's like. Well, too early to tell. That's one of the things I like about the Chinese, frankly. You know that famous anecdote where Zhou Enlai is asked, "What do you think about the French Revolution, Mr. Zhou?" And he said, "It's too early to tell."
I purposely didn't prepare any remarks for this, knowing that Jayant and Doug would give me plenty of material to play off of, and they've been extremely generous. In fact, with that, I ran out of paper, and at the risk of running out of time, I'll just cover a few things. The first thing I think is that Jayant's concept of the West doesn't exist. This sort of rational, unenvious, gentle, charitable place. I've not been there. It sounds like a hell of an idea to me. When Jayant talks about the decay evident in third world cities, I would invite him to walk 6 blocks east of here to Main and Hastings, or to go online and get a copy of the San Francisco shit map. I realize that there are degrees, but the idea that the West that he describes exists in some place other than a place that's better than Bhopal, I think is problematic. When we talk about corruption, being in the resource business, without going into exquisite detail, let's just say that I know a reasonable bit about corruption. And we have this odd sense, I think, maybe Jayant doesn't, but we have this odd sense that money stolen from us by the legislature in English, according to the rule of law, is somehow less gone than it is in other places. Like there's some special difference between an efficient bribe, one where a politician must deliver service, and a campaign contribution. I'll leave that to you to explain to me. Now, I agree with Jayant and Doug both with regards to politicians. I agree with Jayant in particular when he describes Modi and his ilk. I get that. I think the job of politicians these days, maybe it has always been, Adrian would be better placed as a historian than I, but I think maybe particularly in an area where there's so much social media and so much attention to media, and also such expectation that the individual has a call on society. I think the role of a politician now, or at least the path to success for a politician, has been to voice outrage. I think that the way you get ahead is not to make society better, but rather, in the more traditional sense described by Mencken, as to understand that elections are advanced auctions of stolen property. I was hearing earlier criticisms of, I can't pronounce her name, AOC and Trump. I think they're the same. I think they each voice the outrage of their own constituency. Now, personally, I favor AOC. She's more fun to look at, she dances better than Trump, and I see no redeeming feature that he has at all compared to her. That isn't to say I like to be led by her, but I don't like to be led by him either. In fact, AOC, Trump, Modi, Boris Johnson, Who's the thug from Venezuela? Maduro? The guy in the Philippines? They're all the same thing. They're all big puffballs. She's a little puffball. Who give vent to a bunch of envious thugs. The suggestion that the rest don't believe in generating wealth before they consume it, voiced by Jayant, well, that's an interesting concept if you're a Westerner. $16 trillion in negative interest rates. In other words, the spenders who are more numerous declaring war on the savers. Negative interest rates don't happen in India or Bolivia. They can't afford something as stupid as negative interest rates. Nobody would give them the money. In the land of the free and the home of the brave, the United States, $100 trillion in debt, on balance sheet and off balance sheet liabilities. We're going to service this debt with the national income, $1.5 trillion in deficits a year. So the idea that we generate wealth, maybe there's a Western new math where you add a column of negative numbers and come up with a positive sum. Western math, I suspect. And then tribalism. Tribalism, right. We're talking Nigeria, India, places like that. We don't think about tribes that are called liberals or conservatives or Democrats or Republicans. Well, I would suggest to you that perhaps, or I would concede to you, that perhaps we're less tribal in the West than they are in the rest. Describing us as somehow above tribalism is something I have a very difficult time with. The concept that the West is this sort of paragon of reason. Now, I have to admit, in this next part, I'm a little bit on shaky ground because I haven't watched television in 30 years or something like that. But the idea that the West is this paragon of reason, I think would be a subject of dispute to anybody who watched CBC or Fox or CNBC, or certainly anybody who listened to either Congress or Parliament. Further, I guess, if we're talking about the advances of the West relative to the rest, post-colonialism, I wonder what would be accomplished if we re-exported our political system to them. I wonder what would happen in those places, as an example, if they benefited from the leadership of people like, I don't know, AOC or Trudeau. So I would only suggest to Jayant that his concept of the West was probably shaped by his repulsion from where he came from. But I would suggest that in many cases for him the West is an ideal, which I happen to share, but I seldom see. I would also say, however, that the metaphor for all this is one I get from Friedland, Bob Friedland. The situation is hopeless, but it need not be serious. And I think that's true for all of us. When I think of Modi, I see Bhandari, and it doesn't bother me too badly. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you.
So I think we'll take questions now. If we could have a volunteer to help with the microphone. You know what I love about this conference is of everything that was said, I think the most offensive thing was my attack on mince pie. You know, yeah. I don't think the microphone is working.
It is. Yeah. It is?
Yeah, the concept of the deep state. I'm just wondering, you talked quite a bit about it. Do you think that Tulsi Gabbard might be a threat to them? And she offers any hope?
No, she doesn't offer any hope. I mean, she looks like a kind of a decent human being, unlike most of her co-panelists. But the problem is that, from what I understand, although she's apparently sincerely anti-war and that, she holds all their economic beliefs, the same ones. So, you know, she's better than most of them, but, you know, it's better to have tuberculosis than cancer, so.
A question at the back.
Test 1, 2.
Don't worry about it, I'll just speak loudly. You mentioned the term entropy, Doug, and if you go to the dictionary and look for the opposite of entropy, which we all know, the wearing down of everything, you'll discover we haven't created a word for it. So a year and a half ago, I created that word called entropy, and it means the building up of our civilization, which we've been doing for about 6,000 years. Now, to give you an idea, from 1906 to 1969, we went from stepping off the ground to stepping off the planet, from flying to the mountain to flying to the moon. In 1948, I could hold one transistor on my thumb. By 1972, I held an entire microprocessor. And by 2019, today, I can hold 30 billion transistors on my thumb. Now, what does that mean? Every grain of rice and every grain of wheat that is grown every year, that's a big number, but we make 1,000 times as many transistors. So the message here is not just the problems we have in organizing our species and civilization, but the salvation is our intelligence and ability as human beings to keep growing and accreting technology, to gain it and build block by block. And I think we'll continue to do that. Are we in trouble? You bet we are. By 2022, 23, we're going to have severe collapse. By 2032, you'll see a loss of confidence in capital and government. But that will be the collapse. What we will continue to have is productivity, invention, creation. People are going to continue working. They're going to continue harvesting. Will we evolve, as Doug says, into a grouping of species that will continue to be intelligent and others that will not? Probably. But the human race is far from over. And as Doug pointed out, he's the only person I've heard that talks about the possibility that our planet could survive for 1 trillion years, because right now we have the technology to support that.
Yeah, no, good news, bad news. That's right.
Anyone else?
You may just have to speak loud.
Yeah, I think you might have to speak loudly because we only have this one up here too. Yes, ma'am.
Political state in the United States right now, it seems like tribalism is sort of rearing its head, and I'm wondering when we have economic issues because of loss of reserve currency or so forth, when we go through this depression that's coming, what's going to happen to us in terms of our influence in the rest of the world? Are we going to become more tribal? It seems like we could use a spanking. We're kind of, right now, we're like a spoiled child throwing a temper tantrum. I think within hard times, at least we can determine what gender we are. We're so ungrounded. I think we could go back to something. So I'm wondering, what kind of dynamic do you see as, are we particularly becoming more tribal after that, or are we going to get some sense off back into it?
Who should answer that? The question, as I understood it, was a suggestion that we were all becoming more tribal, and was there going to be a reckoning? Did I?
No, I'm in the United States right now. I mean, the way I interpret it, I see, the AOCs for the squad. To me, it's almost like tribalism rearing its head right now, and I see the depression coming on, and I'm thinking, he said that we were an influence in the rest of the world, but I'm thinking after we lose our reserve currency, to be quite honest, I made the analogy to like a spoiled child. He's throwing a temper tantrum. I'm wondering, after we have depression and so forth, how are we going to come out of this? Are we going to become, as a country, more tribal? Or are we going to have some sense knocked back into us in terms of influencing everyone else?
Doug, I wonder if in your mind you believe that the United States is more political and more tribal than it used to be. I mean, Mencken is an example describing elections as advanced auctions of stolen property. That wisecrack that politics was defined by understanding the words, poly from the Latin for many, tick, small blood-sucking insect. Looking back at American history, I'm not sure there aren't a lot of precedents for where we are now, but perhaps you'd take that. You're a better student of history.
Well, no, you're absolutely right about that. It's always been that way, but the U.S., and this isn't, I know, when the Irish and the Italians and the Chinese and every other group came here, they were all their own little subgroups and so forth. But I think it's more serious now than it was in the past. It's just an opinion. We'll have to wait and see.
I think countries like the U.S. and Japan end up embracing immigration for the reasons that Rakesh outlined earlier, is that we need to grow. And I think whether you like it or not, that's going to be the solution.
Well, just to respond to your question, I think indeed the West will continue to become more tribal. There's nothing is stopping it. And in my talk, when I talked about the West, I was talking about the Western civilization. I was talking about the principle. Now, what went wrong with the West was that the concept of reason has to be institutional, should be in the institutions. What went wrong with the West was that we brought in democracy. And democracy is anti-meritocratic system. And once you have the most powerful and the governing organization as anti-meritocratic, which is irrational, it has to slowly eat away everything that civilized society created as a civilization. So my view is that it is democracy that is primarily responsible for destroying the West. And because we haven't even started to think about how we get rid of democracy, there is no rescue for the West. My hope is that before the term of Trump is over, he declares dictatorship and brings an end to democracy. And that is the only hope for the West.
But, once again, I'll bet, I mean, it's hard to say, but I'll bet in 25 years, a combination of artificial intelligence and advances in robotics and bioengineering, there will be androids among us that will be hard to distinguish from real people. That's going to solve and as well as create a whole bunch of new problems that may obviate all these things we're talking about now.
Another question?
Got one over here.
I'm going to question the value of prosperity. And we're very proud of what the West is doing. But we know when we look at Europe and we look at the US and Canada, that prosperity also, like everything else that humans do, has a side that's advantageous and has a side that's destructive. Prosperity has made people weak, and prosperity has made people comfortable with not dealing with conflict. Everybody wants to be nice. We know when attacks occur in Europe, it's the Americans and Canadians who have jumped in and saved the people on a particular train when the terrorist was going to kill them. So I don't know whether the people who are very comfortable, like the academics behind their closed doors, whether they are able, whether they have the skills, the courage, whether they're able to deal with the very real, difficult problems that society is presenting. So I'm interested in utopias, and I know the end of all utopias, that the human corruption eventually gets to the utopia. So still good luck, and still I have hope, but it's double-edged. It's unpredictable. And a scientist once said, the bacteria wins in the end.
That's an excellent question. I think Jayant has something intelligent to say. I just want to say that if the conclusion of all this is that prosperity is bad, I'd invite Rick and Doug to transfer some of theirs to me.
No, he was making a wisecrack. He wants you to talk.
Okay. Well, I agree with you. Prosperity does make people lazy, and because they have less internal push to think about the future. When they wake up in the morning, there's electricity and there's water and there's heated water. Yes, I think they become intellectually lazy. I still think that that is a secondary cause. The primary cause of the degradation that's happening in the West is democracy, because it has enabled bread and circuses to dominate the institutions of the West, and it has enabled the bottom of the barrel people to rise to the very top because they are demagogues.
I'll make a serious comment. I think I agree with what you just, your observation. However, if you look at prosperity on the extreme, meaning the people that are pushing the envelope, I mean, they're completely motivated by the prosperity. Look at Elon Musk, for example. It's in part, anyway, the prosperity that keeps pushing society forward. So I think it's double-edged.
Yeah, I'm all for prosperity. Prosperity gives us the leisure to think and invent, and I don't want to live under a bridge grubbing for roots and berries. Not interested in that. More is better.
That's too bad. Rick, you're my last hope.
I thought you and Doug were agreeing with each other. I must not have been paying it. No, I don't have much to say. I'll leave it there. I don't have much to say.
All right, maybe one more question? Yeah, one more question.
Yeah, one
over.
back here.
The wealthy pay quite a bit in taxes in order to support public sector systems, and yet still have enough funds over to fund private systems that they actually work on for education, transportation, local governance, these sorts of things. Given the tendency of the market to drive availability of goods and services initially available only to the wealthy into the hands of the greater population, what sort of impact do you think that's going to have over the time? Is the state going to wither away, or how violently will it fight back? Any thoughts on how that might play out?
That's a great question. The great failure of capitalism is that it's generated so much individual wealth that we've been able to subsidize private stupidity, which I think is a real shame. On the other hand, I guess I'm a beneficiary of it. What you find, even despite all the problems, is that individually we're so creative and we work so hard that individually we generate so much wealth that we seem to be able to sustain our collective stupidity. It's hopeful and distressing at the same time. I would point out, however, that I think that issue is going to begin to get called. If you look in Canada as an example, where taxes consume now 44% of the average working Canadian's income, yet the deficit and the debt goes up. If you were, and I'm not saying you will, my suspicion is if you were to have a replay of 2008, in other words, where there was a credit contraction that obviated our ability to engage in what they call modern monetary theory, which if you did it would be called counterfeiting. If there was a crisis in confidence that enabled us not to be able to steal from each other anymore via worthless debt, then the ability of the taxpayer, the productive taxpayer, to subsidize the rest of society, much of which is done on credit, becomes problematic. It's interesting when I look at the younger people in the room, if you're American, we have something like $100 trillion net present value of unfunded liabilities, Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, stuff like that. These are benefits that my generation has promised itself that we've handed off to the youngsters. What would happen if the youngsters said, no thanks, you guys voted it, you pay for it? I think that would be a very interesting set of circumstances. I'm not saying it's going to happen, and I'm not saying the outcome would be pretty. All this stuff that we talk about, Doug has the best quote of all. He says, you know, I'm really curious to see how all this unfolds. I really want to watch it from somewhere far away on a broad screen TV.
Okay, I think we're going to, oh, we got to,
Jayant, I disagree with you that prosperity makes you intellectually lazy. If you're starving, you have no focus. You can't think about future. You can't do anything. So tell me how prosperity makes you lazy.
I was talking about prosperity in the West, where people have enough to eat and they are living a relatively luxurious life. That is where prosperity might make people lazy. The society has to create, and families have to create a system in which people stay passionate about living a productive life, even if they have money. And you can see that among some of the kids of some very rich people. In Vancouver, for example, they do drugs, and we were discussing about some of those people, Rajni, and they have no passion for life. They don't want to do anything in life. So that's where that was the only thing I meant. Now, prosperity in the third world is disastrous because they got prosperity for free. And when you get prosperity for free, what you do is what's happening in the Middle East, for example. You get the arms to fight with each other, and you get into hedonism, which is what's happening in India and some other parts of Indian subcontinent. So undeserved prosperity is suicidal for a society, and that's, I think, is what's happening in the Middle East and Indian subcontinent.
Yeah, lack of responsibility. It's not prosperity which is responsible for laziness. It's being...
Sure, I don't disagree with you. I think it's just we are using different words, but I was talking about how easy money leads to that problem.
I know we're wrapping up now, Jayant, so I just want to thank you and Rajni for all your hard work and for including us as part of your seminar. We really appreciate it.